It's January 26th, 1962, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
So it was today in history in 1962 that an artwork called the Zone de Sensibilité Picturale Immatérielle by the French artist Yves Klein came to its dramatic conclusion when Klein performed an elaborate ritual by the banks of the river Seine, throwing the gold that he had been paid for the artwork into the river and burning the receipt of ownership that he had given in exchange for the artwork. Or should I say he threw half of the gold that he had been paid into the river, the other half he pocketed because, even when you're explicitly satirizing and criticizing capitalism, you still got to make a buck somehow, right?
Yeah, of the 8 zones that Klein ultimately sold, 3 buyers chose to end it this way with this ritual on the banks of the Seine. This was the first, and the recipient was the Italian novelist Dino Buzzati. He did it twice in the following month, one with the artist Claude Pascal, and the third with the American screenwriter Michael Blankfort. So those who elected to keep their zones could actually resell them. And that sounds a bit complicated, but we'll get into it. Klein had like a ledger of transfers of the zones. Keep in mind, the zones are nothing. The zones are zones of immateriality, as in nothingness. So, but he was tracking the ownership of the zones in a ledger, and the art newspapers compared this to NFTs and blockchains, and it is a very similar thing. You don't own a physical item; you own a receipt of nothing, essentially.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I suppose on a show like this, we'd eventually get round to Yves Klein because the art that he did was public spectacle. We like that sort of thing. But if you were to cover Yves Klein probably prior to about 2020, I suppose the thing you'd pick as his artwork that everyone remembers, well, it would be either getting women to paint with their boobs, where his models became living brushes, as he called it, or it would be his patenting of International Klein Blue, which was him actually copywriting a colour, the blue that he painted with.
Which is the best colour in the world, by the way. It is actually the greatest colour.
I think I've got a shade of Farrow and Ball blue that I prefer in my office, but all right, if you say so.
Well, Eddie Redmayne would certainly agree with you, Arion, because when he was a student at Trinity College, Cambridge, he wrote his history of art dissertation on International Klein Blue, 30,000 words.
It's so good. It's just like any time you see an Yves Klein work in a gallery, it's just the most mesmerizing thing. Even though it was another statement about capitalism sucking, I just think it was a really beautiful color that he created.
Just like Olly when he's standing transfixed in front of Farrow and Ball swatches.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, here we are doing the episode that I was just saying we're not doing. So we're not talking about those things because basically of NFTs, right? So as Rebecca suggested, kind of like since about 2020, 2021, when you see Yves Klein being mentioned, it's in reference to this artwork, which had been forgotten about for a while, but it is sort of eerily prescient of NFTs and what Beeple and Christie's and the like have done since then, selling thin air, essentially.
Yeah.
French newspapers at the time reported it as such. Klein sells wind was one of the headlines.
Yeah, well, he got to it after he had come up with this other relatively bonkers idea for a hovering sculpture, and he never actually implemented this one, but he applied for and received a patent for that idea for an artwork, and then he wrote about it enthusiastically to his usual art dealer, Iris Clert, and she seemed to have mentioned it to one of her other artist pals, which Klein had explicitly said he didn't want to happen, and this led to a serious argument between Klein and Clert, and Klein then basically withdrew all his artworks from her gallery, and he told Clert's assistant to inform anyone interested in buying his work that all his paintings were now invisible, and if the buyer now wanted one, they had to write him a check. And he further went on to specify that the check had to be very visible and very real. But then Clert started telling this anecdote to people who came into the gallery, and one of them, Peppino Palazzoli, who is an Italian gallerist, he thought that it was rather a good idea and he wanted to buy one. And so, trying to patch up this broken relationship, Clert then went to Klein and said, I've got a sale for you of one of your invisible artworks, but how about we take it a step further and you come up with a proper receipt that can be given? And then basically that morphed into this idea. It sort of fed into Klein's thinking towards this idea of kind of having a receipt, but then you have to get rid of the receipt and I'll throw away the money and nothing will be left. And it will be this grand statement on kind of ownership and also the total immateriality personality, as he said himself, of everything to do with it.
Palazzoli paid for his zone with 20 ounces of gold, which is worth about £1,000 today, and he received a receipt that had been designed by Klein to resemble a banker's cheque. But if the purchaser of the zones agreed, and again he did manage to sell 8, the transaction would build up to this denouement called the ritual that we've described, the one that happened on this day with Dino Buzzati. Klein and the buyer would meet along the Seine with an art critic present as well. Again, he wasn't dumb. He realised that this was a good way to draw attention as well. The buyer would turn over their receipt, their certificate of ownership. Klein threw half the gold into the river. The other half he later used in a series of artworks that used gold leaf. But in doing this ritual, Klein declared, as kind of the inventor of the zones, he would know how the rules of how the zones worked. In doing this, the zone would truly become part of the buyer, but those who chose to keep their receipt of ownership, perversely, would never truly own it.
I mean, like all of his work, it's a thing that it seems to me you sort of get the idea of without having to have had the pain of actually having to be there. I mean, I just feel like I appreciate what you're saying about you actually, aesthetically admire the colour blue that he puts in some of his sculptures and his paintings. But generally, like the conceptual art that he has been hugely influential upon is all about having an idea. And then it doesn't really matter whether you're there or not because the idea happened. He did a monotone silence symphony, he called it, where a full orchestra plays one note for 20 minutes and then there's silence for 20 minutes. And you do see people who have been to reprisals of this event saying, oh, it's just, being in the concert hall after that note stops, the resonance in the air, you just really feel it and it really makes you think about spirituality. It's like, well, maybe, but I can imagine that, and I'd have to get a babysitter. Do you know what I mean? I'd have to go to London and put on a tuxedo, and I'm not doing that for you satirising my life. I don't want that. I can get that idea without actually putting the effort in, and I feel like this as well. Like it's interesting, isn't it, that a screenwriter, as you said, was one of the people who took part in this artwork. I think the people that admired Yves Klein were also creatives or people that were making things, wanted to be part of it. But I think most people don't want to be part of it. You can read that it happened and that's enough.
I don't know about that. I sort of feel like, I've been at stadiums when there's been a minute's silence, and there is something enormously powerful about
but then something else happens.
Yeah, that's true. It is a minute silence rather than, 20
Imagine
minutes.
queuing around the block to go and look at an empty gallery. I mean, it's kind of funny as a concept. It's not funny when you're there.
Okay, well, Michael Blankfort himself described the whole experience of the transaction that day at the Seine when he had his receipt burned in front of him and watched gold being thrown into the river. He said that it was really awe-inspiring. He actually wrote that he'd had no other experience of art equal to the depth of feeling of the sale ceremony. He said it evoked in me a shock of self-recognition and an explosion of awareness of space and time. And I suppose you would want to say that after paying quite a lot of money.
If you don't feel that way, then you've just done something really stupid.
Yeah, but at the same time, I can imagine that it must have been a moment, and you would have also been gathered with the great and the good of the Parisian art scene, and that must have been
No, but you're with him, aren't you? That's the thing, you're with Yves Klein. So if you worship Yves Klein, then you're paying to be with him. In that sense, it's like people having their picture taken with Beyonce for $200, isn't it? It's just that.
Exactly.
Really?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think part of the impact that it had was also the fact that performance art, in the modern sense that we all think of it now, was kind of new at the time. It started to emerge in the early 60s, really, and the Nouveau Réalisme movement that Klein had co-founded was one of the driving forces behind it, especially in France. Performance art, it's hard to pinpoint exactly who started it, but the idea was that it broke with the rules of traditional performance and drama. It can deviate from scripts, from narratives, and also the relationship between the performer and the audience. Some of the magic, if you like, of performance art for those who enjoy it is that the art is what is emerging from the connection between the audience and the artist in the moment. Something that's completely unguided. So it had its roots in multiple art movements, probably most of all Dadaism, which was like the anti-art movement around the early 20th century, and it rejected social conventions and aesthetic standards in favour of spontaneity, chaos, absurdism, and Klein's movement really played into that. He developed it in 1960 with an art critic called Pierre Restany. Restany had actually coined the term to describe an exhibition of artwork by Klein and several other artists. And it's often summarized as being a French version of pop art. But the aesthetic of Nouveau Réalisme was about, well, Restany called it a poetic recycling of urban, industrial and advertising reality. So it was, taking art and blending it with real world influences.
And also always with a bit of a sense of humour, you know, part of the fun.
I'd be laughing too.
Exactly. Who's the joke on? His patrons. That's what's funny about it.
Oh, well, he had a response to that criticism. He said, "Believe me, one is not robbed when one buys such paintings. It is I who am always robbed because I accept the money," which I think is very funny.
Patreon.com/retrospectors.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at CLUB RETROSPECTORS. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.